I'm going to outline the 10 antinomies of apocalyptic humanism. Apocalyptic humanism is my ethical, theological, political stance towards the world and the future, to be distinguished from Transcendental Qabala, which is a philosophy system. And it's comprised of 10 articles of faith or principles, which I refer to as antinomies, because they're not theses, they're more like topics or questions that have a paradoxical quality which need to be savored, I guess, in the way that I see it. I see these questions as constitutive of the spiritual horizon of the present. Their basis is the spiritual horizon of 19th century Europe, where Kabbalah, Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, and Christianity were all sort of combined for the first time in the context of the arts and philosophy. The work of figures like Hegel, Blake, and Nietzsche are all encoded with this same set of concerns that's a mix of all these different esoteric currents from the past that were kind of encountering one another for the first time. In the 21st century, with the rise of the digital and the internet and so forth, some of these points need to be refined, but they're mostly the same, and really the key is that they need to be designated and consolidated for what they are, because they're often not taken seriously altogether. So the first antinomy concerns knowledge, and the question is, what are the limits of human knowledge? One view would be that God's mind executes a type of knowledge that the human mind will never be able to match, that the way we know is fundamentally different and lesser. But we also see in the present that the human mode of knowing can transform. That's what the rise of mathematical physics did, for example. And now we have machine learning. And so there's just this question of like how much can humans know? Because if it were possible to know all things, that would be like being God. That antinomy is a very important topic for our time. The second antinomy involves redemption of suffering. So there's an age-old mystical theme that there's a constitutive wound that is a dark night of the soul, a crucifixion that we go through, and the process of going through it redeems it, because you sort of learn and grow and reach a higher maturity through it. And in the present, it's a big question whether the suffering in the world will end up redeemed or not. It's difficult to take seriously that it will, but from a certain philosophical vantage point, you could argue that it will. So that's the second antinomy. The third is the question of theogony, basically the question of whether God is being born through human history. There are esoteric traditions that say this is the case. From the Christian perspective, it's actually a heretical idea. In our contemporary time, there are theories that consumer capitalism and the internet are sort of coalescing into God's mind. So it's another question on the horizon. The fourth antinomy involves the nature of Christ's death and resurrection. So basically, does the Messiah just bring knowledge that we can use to sort of climb out of the abyss of history? Or was Christ's death and resurrection a sacrifice that caused the possibility of redemption, which we can participate in through our faith in Christ alone, rather than through practical utilitarian knowledge or political organizing? Then there's the question of history as a series of horizons of intelligibility, where each horizon has a set of axioms which it can't fully formulate, but it also has contradictions within it. And once those contradictions are rooted out, the horizon collapses and a new horizon emerges. And this is an important thought for Hegel and Marx and Nietzsche. And I think the antinomy here is whether there's a teleological series of horizons like that, or whether they are sort of just simply wandering, and no one horizon can really be judged from the perspective of any other. That's a more Althusserrian or Heideggerian approach. Number 7 concerns kenosis. It's the question of whether God emptied himself out into the world when modernity began. So this is sort of a Hegelian thesis, maybe, that God really was transcendent before the scientific revolution, but now that humans have been able to change nature and so forth, God is actually gone, and he's only still alive in the context of humanist secular ideals. So that's another question, or it's heretical to think that that is so from the Christian perspective, but it's kind of a mainstream idea. Certainly that all we have is sort of secular humanist values, though typically people don't see the latter as being rooted in a notion that at one time God really was transcendent. Usually the idea is that there never was a God. Number 8 is the theme of like a judging God, like an old God that maybe was good for a time but has now become evil, and there's actually a temple to be destroyed so that the new temple can be created. And maybe even there's a Nietzschean version of that, where our values of things like social justice need to be stripped away or destroyed so that entirely new values can be born. But ultimately, we could imagine that it's just a matter of returning to a form of piety that has been available for a long time and that is fundamentally transcendent above history, and isn't something that evolves or ever becomes outdated. Number 9 involves the question of the nature of enlightened awareness. So one can imagine either that it involves creative fervor, like a sort of like the art world is kind of like this. It's like, oh, that's just activity, this mayhem going on, and that's just kind of a flashing life, and that's what enlightenment is. Or is the more ancient ideal correct, that a state of enlightened awareness is actually a kind of cold, abstract ability to be the exact opposite of that, basically. And finally, there's the question of how systematic and how abstract the relationship between these 10 theses ought to be. So one can take for granted an ideal that we need to be using Occam's razor to have a set of ideals that all make sense together, that even maybe logically follow from one another, that can be expressed in an exact way and, you know, transmitted in a smooth way with no information loss. But on the other hand, in the mystical realm, in the mythical realm, a lot of times principles simply just happen to be what they are, and there's no like abstract reason for them. And also, they're not just principles, they're actually concrete but non-material entities that are almost like people or personalities. So that's another major antinomy. So the idea, I think, is that even considering these 10 questions all at the same time and understanding that they're all serious and real questions, and that within the field of these antinomies, there's nothing that's absurd. There's no option among these options that there's evidence against. Thinking of all these things at the same time and maybe having openness to the answers to these questions emerging as a result, perhaps in part, of practice that is motivated by these questions, that would sort of constitute apocalyptic humanism.